Thank you, Greg, and thank you everyone for being here for our fourth week as we reach the 1990s. I was born and architecture makes a turn back to neo-modernism. Tonight, we will be learning about three more Cranbrook visitors, Juhani Pallasmaa, Elizabeth Diller, and Jacques Herzog. And as we continue to move apace through the history of American architecture, from Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, and Alvar Aalto to last week with the theoreticians of John Haydock, Aldo Rossi, and Stanley Tigerman. We hit the point in our sort of rotation of styles where modernism and all that it signified about mechanization and abstraction has come back to the fore, particularly in the work of Herzog and de Meuron. Tonight's theme could equally be labeled descendants, as John Haydock was the educator of Elizabeth Diller, and Aldo Rossi was the educator of Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron. Juhani Pallasmaa, a Finnish architect and thinker and author, was providing a theoretical backing for much of the work that was happening in the late 80s and 1990s. So just like our first week when we had a Finn and a Swiss and an American, we tonight have another set of Finn, Swiss, and American architects. Tonight's lecture will travel from Pallasmaa, who is a generation older than Diller, Scofidio, and Herzog and de Meuron. And as we look at these architects and how they changed over time, if last week we saw sort of theoreticians who were not building as many buildings as perhaps they wanted to, tonight we're going to see a real change where I want to focus on this moment in architecture history, the vignette of sort of 1988 to 1992. But what has happened since 1992 in the work of Diller, Scofidio, and Herzog and de Meuron is a real transformation into starchitects. So at the end of the lecture, we'll look at some of their more recent work. But we're going to focus for the majority of our time on the time that they spent at Cranbrook. With Pallasmaa, his first lecture here was 1979, but I'm going to focus on his 1989 lecture and his return in 1994. Elizabeth Diller spoke here in 1988 and Jacques Herzog in 1992. Pallasmaa writes that the task of architecture is to beautify and to create sort of memories and the idea of our body in space. Diller, Scofidio see their architectural practice more as an exploration of seeing. They create buildings, art installations, performances, books, dances, photographs, theater sets, videos, and consumer objects. And each of those projects has an architectural backing, and each is self-contained rather than self-referential. Herzog and de Meuron, who we'll end with, their architecture is really all about construction, and construction is the substance more than the theory, more than any sort of theory of their architecture. Just to again review how we've gotten here to week 4, starting with the architecture program established by Eliel Saarinen in 1931, and then led by Glenn Paulson in the 1960s, to last week and the remarkable transformation of the department under Daniel Libeskind and President Roy Slade. Now, all of the lectures up to this point have taken place around campus, whether it was St. Dunstan's or the Institute of Science Auditorium, but all three of the visitors this week spoke in the brand new DeSalle Auditorium, designed by Robert Saarinen Swanson, the grandson of Eliel and Loya, and the son of Pipson and Bob Swanson, who is seen here with Governor and Trustee Betty Williams, Todd Williams's mother, and Roy Slade. And this model shows where the DeSalle Auditorium is located between the Art Museum columns and the Orpheus Fountain. So that's where our visitors were speaking, and all three were the guest of Dan Hoffman. Dan Hoffman arrived at Cranbrook the same year that the DeSalle Auditorium was completed, 1986. And Dan Hoffman led the architecture department until 1996. He moved it to its current location, and he framed his practice at Cranbrook with an extended metaphor of weaving. For Hoffman, if weaving was the craft of Cranbrook, he was attempting to build architecture that wove together handicraft and machine production, infrastructure and landscape, and the Cranbrook legacy of Saarinen and the applied arts with contemporary life. Dan Hoffman was a graduate of Cooper Union, studied under John Haydock, and he came to Cranbrook after working for William Kessler and Edward Larrabee Barnes and teaching in Detroit in Canada. He succeeded the highly theoretical practice of Dan Libeskind, and he really brought architecture education at Cranbrook back to its roots in the poetics of building. Here we see the department as it is today in the garage, where the students could then embark on actual construction. He published this book, Architectural Studio, in 1994, and it documented the practice of his leadership as architect in residence. And it was a practice that really focused on full-scale production, a craft-centered approach to making. And so projects by students included this sort of Vitruvian man setup where the viewer occupies this architectural sculpture, this sort of machine that then measures the proportions of the body. Or on the right, this sort of explosion of domestic space arranged in the art gallery. At the center is my favorite of Dan Hoffman's experimental projects, which is a concrete block wall that he built without mortar. And he assembled the concrete blocks in the architecture studio. As he assembled the wall, he had an automatic camera photographing the process. And he then used those photos and he printed them on the wall or on the individual blocks and then rebuilt the wall. And so in the center, you see the original wall at top. The center shows the wall with those printed images of the wall's construction. And then at the bottom is that printed concrete block. Less theoretical were some of the projects that remain on campus, including the Pickle Hut of 1996 on the left, the entrance feature in 1994 at the bottom right, and the Trellis Bridge with Theodore Galante in 1993. He also designed the campus lighting, and all of these projects were constructed with student or recent alumni labor. So it really got back to Eliel Saarinen's idea of Cranbrook as a sort of medieval village, where the architect in residence designed for the community, and the students served as the craftspeople, pairing with industry outside of Cranbrook's campus. The arrival or the entrance feature on Woodward Avenue in the lower right was a partnership with our first visitor, Juhani Pallasmaa. Pallasmaa was an architectural critic and author practicing in Finland who traveled the globe lecturing about phenomenology in architecture. Pallasmaa asked, why do so few modern buildings appeal to our emotions? When an anonymous house in an old town, an unpretentious farm building, will give us a sense of familiarity and pleasure. The building of our own time may make us curious with the daring of its inventiveness, but they give us little sense of the meaning of our world and our own existence. And here at Cranbrook, Pallasmaa's only American project was executed at the new intersection of the Woodward Access Road and Institute Way, midway between Cranbrook Institute of Science and Cranbrook Art Museum. And I'll return to the arrival feature here at the end of the lecture, but I wanted you to keep this piece in mind because I think that it embodies a lot of the theory and practice of making and architecture that we'll see tonight. Pallasmaa grew up on his grandfather's farm in rural Finland with his mother and 5 sisters during World War II. He saw a certain sincerity and economy to farm life, where everything that was necessary could be done by the farmer on the farm. He went to college at the Helsinki Institute of Technology. He did not want to be an architect, but he saw Eliel Saarinen's drawings on the walls of the school. Eliel was, of course, an alumni, and it transformed his thinking, and he was introduced to architecture. He studied abroad in Minneapolis, where he became a Minnesota State champion skier and jiver. And then he began working at the Museum of Finnish Architecture in his second year of school in 1958. The Museum of Finnish Architecture was a sort of anti-Alvar Aalto center of thought of Finnish rationalism. If Alvar Aalto presented the humanist, idiosyncratic way of architecture, the Museum of Finnish Architecture was a place where logic and philosophy and modular systems reigned supreme. As director of the Museum of Finnish Architecture from 1978 to 1983, Pallasmaa led this institution and sort of became the spokesperson for Finnish architecture in the second half of the 20th century. His relationship to Cranbrook began by way of introduction from John Hejduk. And so here we see a mailgram in Cranbrook archives where Roy Slade is mailgramming Juhani Pallasmaa because John Hejduk of the Cooper Union told me to contact you. This very formal beginning of a relationship would continue for the next 2 decades, with here the last fax between Roy Slade and Pallasmaa, where he says, "Our friendship has meant a great deal to me and to Cranbrook, and I trust that our friendship will continue as will relations between Finland and Cranbrook." And Pallasmaa really does represent a reconnection between the ancestral homeland of the Saarinens, Maija Grotel, and other Finnish artisans at Cranbrook, and the sort of academy of the 1980s and 90s. In his lecture in 1989, Pallasmaa was promoting a new book about Finnish architecture. He spoke at length about the Finnish national romantic movement embodied by Eliel Saarinen's design for the National Museum of 1910, as well as the sort of forest architecture of Alvar Aalto. His earlier critiques of Aalto, he would say, stemmed from the thought that when Aalto was alive, we could not imitate him. When the old oak fell, a lot of Aalto imitations and inspiration were born. So while he was speaking at Cranbrook about the sort of Finnish forest aesthetic, Pallasmaa's own early work had been something much more abstract and much more modular. The moduli system, which over 200 houses were built in Finland using Pallasmaa's systems of prefabricated panels and hooks, foundations and pins, and you could sort of grow the building from a single square up to entire little villages of modular buildings. It's, I think, something that John Hejduk would have admired, and it really emphasized this rational thinking and the importance of technology. It reflected the work of Le Corbusier and the Maison Citron, the machine for living, and it also embodied the ideas of the American architect Buckminster Fuller, who Pallasmaa knew from his studies, who created the sort of helicoptering in prefabricated aluminum Dymaxium house that's over at the Henry Ford Museum, and Prouve, who in France designed a house that could be completely packed up on the back of a truck and then built anywhere in the landscape. Pallasmaa was inspired by modular and moving architecture, but also by American West Coast rationalism and the case study houses. Here we see Ralph Rapson, Cranbrook graduate, and his design for Case Study 4, which was again a prefabricated sort of plywood and steel butterfly roofed house. And you can see the homeowner helicoptering in. So all of this sort of rational prefabricated architecture begins to become questioned by Pallasmaa. He begins to wonder, maybe Alvar Aalto had more going for him than I initially thought. And he would describe the strong experience of a warm, intimate, and protective interior space of a house with lit windows in the evening dusk of a snow-covered landscape. He writes, "This is space experienced through the cells of the skin." So even though this house is one of his modular homes, he begins to think of architecture as this phenomenological experience, that our bodies, our senses are interacting with the building and with our understanding of the building. His work becomes more grounded in the landscape, like this summer house that still has that sort of California modern look. But when we get closer, it uses these thick boulders, wood construction, an asymmetric suspended table, and pieces like this great barrel become occupying and signifying that this isn't just modern architecture, it's Finnish modern architecture. And he begins to respond to the rocky landscape of Finland, much in the way of his predecessor, with Saarinen and his partners Gazelius and Lindgren, and their early work in Helsinki defining the national romantic style as sort of variation of the Art Nouveau and the Richardsonian Romanesque, where all of the detailing become little Finnish animals and little Finnish plants. And the granite of the building is from the hills of Finland, and the architecture of the building is equally Finnish. Pallasmaa actually lives in a Saarinen building, though not this exact fire insurance building. And one of his early projects was the renovation of the family home, where, like Saarinen and Aalto before him, Pallasmaa designs the fireplace, the furniture, the tables, the chairs, and the sort of reconstruction of this Saarinen attic into a family home. In his Cranbrook lecture, though he spoke about Finnish historic architecture, he ended with slides of his own work, including a project that he said was greatly troubling because of its prominent location. Behind the fire insurance building, it was building an alleyway in a sort of outdoor courtyard. So Saarinen's building is here, and Pallasmaa was restoring the lobby, and then the courtyard is slipped in behind it. He works with the Finnish painter Jorma Hattila, who creates this sort of Mexican color palette of warm colors, and it becomes this sort of festival alleyway where there is a minimalist colonnade of a circle, triangle, and square in teak, steel, and granite, which marks the line of cars and pedestrians, but also serve as bodies in space. This very tall, narrow, awkwardly shaped space. Now you have these sort of symbolic forms of the upright human in the center of this square. And that concrete is the vehicular entrance down into the underground parking. He then sort of pedestrianizes this little square, and he wanted to bring a sort of Mediterranean plaza into the north of Finland. All of the sort of construction of steel and glass that surrounded the buildings were connected to an elaborate system of gutters that ended with his idea of the village well. And so it was a place that was thrilling on a snowy day when things would be covered in white, in a rainy day where you suddenly realize the gutters are spiraling down to this well, or on a very warm summer Finnish day when the warm colors are sort of transporting you to a much more Mediterranean or Mexican climate. The other work he spoke about at Cranbrook, which he ran out of time, and at the end of the cassette tape, I just hear, that's all I'll talk about. There's more slides, but we won't get to them. So I only know of these buildings that he presented, but he talked about the redesign of a building in Paris by the architect Hoffman, where he slips in the Finnish Institute, which was meant to be a combination of 19th century French engineering and 20th century Finnish values wrapped up in a quiet architectural expression. And his art museum renovations in Eliel Saarinen's hometown, where the brick building is a former bus depot. It had survived in partial destruction during the Winter War and was one of the only buildings to survive the war. The town gathered up the bricks and reconstructed the bus depot. So Pallasmaa discussed with the students that even though the architectural value of this utilitarian structure might not have been that high, the emotional value to the villagers was extremely important. And so he wanted to tap into this sort of idea of going out and gathering the bricks and reconstructing by turning a utilitarian bus warehouse into a museum. And he uses this abstract row of granite pillars, almost again like a minimalist sculpture, to symbolize the cultural function of the building over the utilitarian. So tapping into ideas about museums having columns. Of course, the columns are themselves quite narrow. There's no lintel across the top, and so they could just sort of tumble to the ground were it not for a steel cable that runs from a steel plate at the top of the columns through the center, and then is sort of tightened and clamped down around the base. The different shades of granite are then subdivided by these metal plates that connect to that steel cable. So he has not only created a sort of timeless architectural ideal, the column, the body, but he has also used this sort of technological approach to constructing it. The inside is then reflective of his great conversion into the wonderful warm world of Alvar Aalto, with these cool curving white plaster surfaces and a beautiful beech wood ceiling. And then he also creates these little nooks where, in a lighting scheme from Pallasmaa's hand, but reflecting Alvar Aalto's designs, he then creates this little intimate corner, almost like a Frank Lloyd Wright fireplace ingle nook, where the scale of the building comes radically down to the scale of a conversation between 2 or 3 people. And he describes his buildings as a laminate of different cultural experiences for mankind. So he's combining sort of Finnish history, the environment, ordinary life with symbols of the spirit and construction details. And in his writings and in his lectures, he refers to important moments in his own experience of architecture as providing a way forward for all architecture, particularly the sort of pure expression of space and communal harmony of the Shakers, and the power of the Japanese garden as a total sensory environment. The intensity and tranquility of our experiences stem from the fact that we use all of the senses, not just sight, but touch, smell, taste. And he's expanding on ideas of Charles Moore and Kent Bloomer in their seminal text, Body, Memory, and Architecture, where Moore and Bloomer write that to at least some extent, every real place can be remembered partly because it is unique, but partly because it has affected our bodies and generated enough associations to hold it in our personal worlds. And Pallasmaa's writings will then continue this idea of body, memory, and architecture as being co-equal aspects of design. You think of sort of falling water and the sound of the water, the feel of the breeze, and Pallasmaa describes it as looking at architecture through the conscious experience of it, that instead of just seeing a building, we feel the building. And he critiques sort of 1980s design, particularly Philip Johnson's postmodernism and the great Chippendale skyscraper AT&T, where Pallasmaa says these superficial return to ancient themes lack emotive power precisely because they collage architectural motifs that are no longer linked with phenomenologically authentic feelings. So he thinks instead of fetishizing historic forms, we should essentially hug our buildings. And this is a painting he uses in writings and lectures where he talks about that this is as close as architecture and man should be, that we should be able to hold the building in our hands, expanding on the philosophies of people like Heidegger, who is the sort of spokesman of phenomenological study of space and the environment. Pallasmaa loves this painting showing dust motes dancing in sunlight because of its sense of silence and its evocation of memories and dreams. He also picks up on something that to this point had been rather forgotten about Alvar Aalto's work. And that was a early article in Aalto's career, 1926, where he writes about Fra Angelico and the Annunciation as being the ultimate representation of architecture. Pallasmaa pulls this one reference from Aalto's early career and uses it to reinterpret Aalto's entire output, where Aalto, instead of just being an architect, he is using form to sort of concentrate the desire for eternal life on earth and really sort of celebrating the idea of threshold, of the relationship of the spirit and the architect, of the column and then the movement through space. And what Pallasmaa praises in Aalto's work and in other works like the Louis Kahn is silence. And remember, Louis Kahn loved silence and light, but for Kahn, he defined silence as the sort of inextinguishable human desire to create. For Pallasmaa, silence was much more literal. It was the elimination of noise. For him, impressive architectural spaces allow you to hear only your own heartbeat. As he writes, the innate silence I have experienced in great architecture results, it seems, from the fact that it turns our attention to ourselves and our very existence. Great architecture is silence turned into matter. He does a little project around the time of his second lecture at Cranbrook, where he creates a memory trace of the sculptor Väinö Aaltonen's home that had been destroyed during the Winter War. And he places on it, very intentionally, a sculpture by Aaltonen that Loja Saarinen had purchased for their house here at Cranbrook. And so Pallasmaa is not only creating this sort of silent environment of the memory of this sculptor's studios, but he's also bringing a bit of Cranbrook back to Finland. And I think that he would have been quite well received. I know he was quite well received. At the end of his lecture, Dan Hoffman tells him he's invited back anytime because he so embodied Hoffman's belief in architecture as a sort of communicative form between the body and built environment. And Pallasmaa ends one of his articles on painting and architecture by contrasting these two pieces, where on the left we see Saint Jerome surrounded by sort of all the knowledge of the world, but surrounded by natural flora and fauna, by architecture, by sunlight, by the study, meditation, a garden. And on the right, we have Edward Hopper's sort of depiction of modern life, where the window is no longer regulating any sort of internal and external world, but everything is out in the open. There is sort of no mercy given to this man at his desk with these sort of anonymous objects across it. Pallasmaa preferred that we live in a world closer to that on the left, where man's position is seen as this sort of harmonious construction of mind, body, and the built environment. Our next visitor, though, presents something more akin to Edward Hopper, where in a landmark work of architectural filmmaking, and you can see this on their website, Overexposed, the Fourth Window traces the course of one day in the PepsiCo building. Designed by Natalie Dubois for SOM, it is this sort of temple of glass commercialism. And in the movie, the camera pans from office to office, and it studies what everyone is doing. And it was filmed without cooperation from the office building, from the hotel next door. At one point, executives called the hotel and said, we think someone is spying on us for trade secrets. And Ricardo Scofidio had to tell them, oh no, I'm an architecture professor and we're studying the detail of the curtain wall construction. But Diller Scofidio really think of architecture as both film, but also as the representation of the window. And in one of their later projects from 2000, Diller Scofidio proposed this interclone hotel, where you have the anonymous hotel that as it travels from Bangalore to Tijuana to Kampala to Ho Chi Minh City, the hotel, the sort of Best Western, is simply decorated, but we're in this great global world. And Pallasmaa himself actually had thoughts on hotels. When he was in Detroit, he was at his motel and he watched the housekeeper go from room to room, turn on the TV and the radio to full volume, and then run her vacuum cleaner. And that this entire assault of television, radio, and vacuum was a representation of America's inability to contemplate silence. So that silence in architecture that Pallasmaa advocated for was somehow missing from life in the 1980s. And I think there is no better office than Diller Scofidio to embody this sort of noise of late 1980s life. And so this brings us to our second visitor, a lecture on February 6th, 1988, from the Polish-born, Bronx-raised architect Elizabeth Diller. She studied under John Haydock and Ricardo at Cooper Union from in the 1970s, 75 to 79. She taught at the Cooper Union from 82 to 1990, and then at Princeton. She studied photography and then took architecture with Ricardo Scofidio. After her graduation, she then became both professional and personal partners with Scofidio, and they started the office of Diller Scofidio. Her understanding of architecture really comes from an understanding of film, and she often places her work in the manner of film and film critique. It is a highly conceptual body of work that we're going to look at tonight, the work of Diller Scofidio in the 1980s. Much like Charles and Ray Eames, who made over 125 short films investigating space, culture, and architecture, Diller Scofidio were very interested in technology of video recording and architecture. And they operated at the intersection of architecture, art, mass culture, and cultural criticism. So in her lecture at Cranbrook, she begins by talking about this great piece of surrealist or Dadaist work, The Bride Stripped Bare of Her Bachelor's Even Are Large Glass. And this work is actually the subject of her entire Cranbrook lecture. In other lectures at Princeton, she would often use a black light, wear all black, and then use a fluorescent glove and chalk in order to draw her lecture onto the chalkboard. In other cases, she would take a bottle of Pepto-Bismol in her purse, and when approached by the sort of egomaniac male architect like Peter Eisenman or Michael Graves, she would pull out the bottle of Pepto-Bismol and bring out her sort of tough responses to this really male-dominated practice. But her talk at Cranbrook, which was a repeat lecture of one she had delivered a year earlier in London, was all about one work of the firm, and it was inspired by the large glass. Her talk at Cranbrook was entirely scripted, and the script really reads like stage directions. She is an incredibly meticulous architect who leaves nothing to chance, works 24/7, and so the fact that her lecture sounds well rehearsed is because it was well rehearsed. And she views the sort of theatrics of her presentation as mirroring the theatrics of her practice. Now, if you don't know large glass, it is one of the most iconic works of 20th century art. And she begins her interpretation of large glass, much as I will treat it now, which is she is not trying to decode large glass, as she says, not trying to autopsy the iconography. I'm satisfied with the fact that it's alchemical and we don't need to rationalize it at all. The idea of the piece is that the bachelors are in the lower half of the glass, the bride is at the upper half of the glass, and it's constructed using oil, varnish, lead foil, wire, and dust sandwiched between two pieces of glass that are then broken. And so you can read into this piece, into Duchamp's mind, but for Elizabeth Diller, it really becomes all about the reflection, which is something that she had become interested in at Cooper Union. Here's a piece she did during her time at Cooper, where just like Duchamp, she scraped away the back of a mirror. So she has half plate glass and half mirror. And then this photograph, a self-portrait of Diller, she's holding the camera shutter release, and then she is photographing her hand, just like Le Corbusier's hand, in the mirror itself. But the reason why her Cranbrook lecture was all about Duchamp's large glass was because of her success designing a recent stage, or the success of Diller Scofidio's stage set. And her stage set could not be more different from the type of proscenium stage that we saw last week with Aldo Rossi, where it's all about the frontality of the theater looking into the scene. Instead, she proposes the same duality that Duchamp has with the bachelors below and the bride above, being reflected by having a giant sheet of reflective mylar on rigging and then a movable screen below, so that the hinge moves and the audience is able to see multiple dimensions of the theater performance while the actors themselves are not in the same space. And so here you see how we can see the actor at the magician's guillotine here. We can see his head coming forward of the wall. We can see these sort of dental lenses floating here. And this piece would move up and down to reflect and control how the audience saw the interaction of the bride, here reflected in the mylar, and the bachelor below, or here the reverse, where the bride is now in front of the audience and the bachelor is only seen in the mylar. It is avant-garde theater with an avant-garde stage set and avant-garde costumes by Diller. And she creates initially these proposals for a giant sort of pulley system of rods that would control the actor's movement. In the end, she creates instead a series of armors that attach and clamp to the body like prosthetics. And she certainly is referencing the great Bauhaus theater movement and Oskar Schlemmer with his stick dance of 1927. And then in the actual performance of it, you begin to see the appearance not just of the actors, but also domestic items. And these sort of anonymous domestic items, essential beds, chairs, televisions, will move throughout the practice of Diller Scofidio in the 1980s and 90s. It's particularly prominent in an interior installation at a little house in San Francisco by the artist David Ireland, and the curator Anne Hatch invited Diller Scofidio to gut the house and rebuild it as what Diller Scofidio call the withdrawing room. It is this sort of nightmare of domestic space. It is a meditation on the ideas of privacy and publicness, of physical and optical and oral vulnerabilities and connections, of etiquette and social order. And so you have the dining room table that is sort of floating up above you, quite difficult to use a dining table in that manner, or the bed, which here is seen pushed together, but then the lead bedspread can actually on wheels roll apart until the beds are in separate rooms of the house. Or the television, which has been removed from its box, and you just have the cathode ray tube, which is suspended by its own wires in front of a chair on these sort of prosthetic stilts. And the danger of this television sort of being detached and whacking you off of this chair. And notice the other chair in the room, which has this sort of spear going through it, where you have, this is the sort of bathroom vanity. And so it's a three-legged chair that you have to then straddle the mirror, and it has this sort of penetrating process, quality to it, as if it has stabbed the sitter straight through their nether regions. And this idea of using sort of furniture, architecture, the body, and danger is something that Diller had explored even at the Cooper Union, where she designed a chair that was filled of cotton and sandbags resting on a bed of nails, in this sort of process-oriented, functional, but very indeterminate furniture form that really is quite different from John Haydock and his ideas of architecture, but that Liz Diller will take and run through her career as the idea of the sort of furniture form as an active participant in its use and in its creation of how we embody space. Now, Diller Scafidio's first significant work of architecture is a house made of plywood. And you can see the grid of the 4-foot by 8-foot sheets of plywood, which form the grid of the house. Cut out of these grids are square windows, which are standard issue windows from the Pella Window Company. And it is this sort of extension of John Haydock's language of gridded architecture. And it sits on the sort of edge of ordinary and transcendent, of memory, of sort of what does a house look like, but also of the sort of disembodied house of is there something sort of ominous about this wall. For John Haydock, the Kinney House demonstrated how contemporary architecture could locate itself within tradition while creatively adapting precedents to new conditions. But Diller Scofidio don't get much other work in the 1980s, and so they take the route of James Wines and site architects, where they apply for public art funding, and they do a series of installations in New York, architectural meditations on public space, like traffic in Columbus Circle, where at 4 in the morning, Diller and Scofidio and some of the students from Cooper Union travel up and down the Jersey Turnpike stealing traffic cones. And then they place them with permission in this 4-by-4-foot grid in Columbus Circle. And it's almost like how snowfall veils unlike things, where you have suddenly a cohesive landscape that is visually linking together the distinct traffic islands of Columbus Circle. And I think it shows a sensitivity to context and how small repeated gestures can create significant architectural experiences. It leads into another art installation, which looks like it's in the rural desert, but is in fact at the base of the World Trade Center in the backfill of the World Trade Center's excavation, where it is the figure of a monolith. Stanley Kubrick is Liz Diller's ultimate idol. And so this monolith acts as both sort of armor and sculpture, as sort of a place where you can enter in and your body is controlled by the machine and the machine is controlling your body. Now, the next piece extends this sort of medieval 1980s surrealism by building a gate to nowhere, but using sort of off-the-rack materials of chain link, sheet steel, and windsocks to create this intervention on the site. And this is work that is not really accepted by the architecture community and not particularly well reviewed by the art community. But I do think that Diller is tapping into larger moves in architecture of this moment, particularly the work of Frank Gehry and his use of off-the-rack prefabricated materials like corrugated aluminum and chain link in renovating his own house, or the work of John Jurdy and Deborah Sussman for the 1984 Olympics, where they attempt to combat the idea of Los Angeles as a non-space with no landmarks by filling it with scaffolding, chain link, and temporary flags to create this sort of presence in the landscape. So Scofidio Renfro or Diller Scofidio are really participating in what was at the time a very West Coast movement of off-the-rack architectural design. Her next significant work was another theater set down in the bowels of the Brooklyn Bridge. And so these brick piers are the anchorage of the great engineering marvel. So all of the Brooklyn Bridge's wires are landing in these brick columns. And then these vaults are used for a theater piece in 1986, where Diller quite cleverly suspends this bridge using just one set of wires that wrap around the bridge, and then it creates this gap. And it's meant to evoke the chambers of the mind and to act as this sort of elegant backdrop to a play where memory and association is the sort of complete idea of the play. Of course, she tapes it on VHS, which becomes the sort of modus operandi of the firm. And I think their most interesting project working with television and closed caption or closed circuit televisions is a piece called Parasite, designed for the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And here, with these elaborate architectural constructions of steel, wire, and wood, televisions are displayed which show either the tops of the circular doors at the entrance of the museum, or aimed right on this sort of miserable Caesar Pelli designed escalators of the MoMA edition. And so you take the escalators down into this gallery space, and then you see the closed circuit, and you think how thrilling to sort of watch someone come down the escalator on closed circuit television. And then you realize everyone in this room just watched me do it. And to get out of this room, they're going to watch me exit the space again. And so she becomes sort of critical of the growing sense of the surveillance state, who is watching who. And then the title of it, Parasite, is this sort of idea of both the parasitic relationship of the camera's gaze to whatever it sees, as well as the idea of a parasitic architecture. So her architecture placed within the confines of Caesar Pelli's gallery space. She also then took the text from the French philosopher Michael Serres, Parasite, and she raised it in embossed letters on the chair that is suspended from the ceiling. So in order to read the sort of theory behind the room, you would have to sit impossibly against a chair with no underwear on, so that the text would be embossed onto your derriere, and then you have a mirror that you can hold and read the philosophical text. And I see it as her sort of snarky critique of the ever expanding and ever more detached architectural theory, that her project sort of speaks for itself. And even though the 1980s demanded her to write some sort of theoretical treatise, she sees that as a little bit past the necessary aims of her show. I think it also reflects even earlier designs for the Museum of Modern Art, where Eero Saarinen and Charles Eames displayed disembodied chairs within the gallery to make the case for modern furniture. Now, the last project of Diller Scofidio that I'll present is, I think, their most significant and most interesting of their early career, the Slow House, designed for Japanese real estate investor Koji Atakura on facing the Long Island Sound. And the idea of this is that it is architecture as a screenplay, as a sort of narrative form. So the little car pulls up to the house, and instead of having a facade, instead of having a front of the house, there's only a door. You open the door, and you're immediately faced with two choices: stairs going down or a pathway going into this main room. It's called the Slow House because it takes the form of a snail with its two antennae sticking up. And the antenna on the left is the chimney, and the antenna on the right we'll get to in a moment. To present it to the client, Elizabeth Diller makes this elaborate construction on plywood and gesso within the architectural tools left attached to the very building. Instead of using terms like kitchen and bedroom, she uses terms like cooking zone, dining zone, sleeping zone. And the entire house is just this simple curve that's sweeping around. But what's interesting about this drawing is what she puts here, which is a rear view mirror looking back to New York City. It is a vacation home. And here, a television screen showing the sound, the waters, the view out front. And the sort of most interesting move in the house is that this second antenna holds a closed circuit television that then projects to a TV that is suspended in front of the view it is projecting. And so it juxtaposes the actual view of the water with the view of the television. And it ironically doubles the visual pleasure, just as it transforms the vista from an actual experience into an electronic idea. You could record the view on VHS and then take it back with you to view in New York. And in this wonderful drawing, which layers color photocopies, magazine clippings, mylar sheets, and architectural drawings, she shows the way that this sort of machine-like television would float in front of your view. And this idea of the view being somehow blocked and doubled by the camera is not necessarily a new one in architecture. I did not include this project in week one, though I should have, because it's probably Le Corbusier's strangest project. But for a fashion designer and general eccentric, Le Corbusier in 1930 had designed a penthouse where on the top level, though you sit with this incredible view of the Arc de Triomphe, there is no view out. Instead, you must use a periscope to appreciate the view. And it's the same idea that Diller is hitting with the idea of the camera providing access to the view. Or John Haydock with the wall house, where the wall is blocking your understanding of the other side. Here we see Alvar Aalto, where he was projecting the electronic billboard of the newspaper into the window. Or Robert Venturi, when he uses the display as a sort of billboard with electronic football games coming across the National Football Hall of Fame. And so this idea of the sort of electronic or screened mediation between view and architecture is, I think, something that has been present across the 20th century and comes to its most elegant sort of achievement with Slow House. Now, the house was built, but it only existed as construction and then as ruin. Mr. Adakura lost his finances in the stock market crash in Tokyo, and so the house was never completed. And so it exists only as an idea and as a series of models. Here, a model where Diller Scofidio uses a mirror to show the floor plan, much the way they did with the theater performance. So the model shows the exterior and then the mirror shows the interior. Or here, where a book has been cut in half and you really get that snail-like quality of the Slow House moving across the sort of compounding human knowledge. Now, in 1994, Diller Scofidio, high off the success of their MoMA show and the Slow House, publishes in the grand tradition of 1990s artist books, a sort of absurd, difficult to use monograph of their body of work entitled Flesh, where every project is then associated with a body part or body movement. That is a picture of Liz Diller on the cover of the book, and she has sat on the word flesh, which then is the title of the book. And if we go to the back cover, it is Mr. Scofidio's portrait. And then the spine of the book divides the two. Now, thinking about this idea of film and documenting architecture as well as of flesh is very much something that's sort of in the air with architecture and design. And I'm reminded of Cranbrook's own sort of entry into this category with the sort of horrifically repulsive poster for the American Institute of Graphic Designers in Detroit at Cranbrook, where the designer of the poster has had his intern carve the poster with an X-Acto knife into his skin. And so it's very much sort of in the air, this idea of the relationship of the body to architecture. I think it also is a moment of distinct sort of torture for the intern, physical torture with the poster, but also Diller Scofidio are known for their sort of extraordinary lengths they go to as far as producing architecture around the clock and the sort of sacrifice of the body to the practice that I think is a sort of toxic side of 1990s architecture. With that image off the screen, we transition to our last visitor, the third set of visitor, Herzog and de Meuron. If Diller Scofidio is all about the sort of mediation of architecture and culture, architecture and screens, architecture and body, and Juhani Pallasmaa is all about the experience of architecture in space and using our senses to come more fully to understand architecture, Herzog and de Meuron are a different beast entirely, where suddenly construction and construction alone is the real sort of purpose and movement of architecture. They came roaring into the scene of American architecture in the early 1980s with an appointment as professor at Harvard, as well as the publication of their first important work, the Ricola storage building, full of delicious Ricola lozenges. It was, I think, a refreshing splash of water to the face after a decade of looking at sort of increasingly eccentric in two direction, either the direction of Herzog and Diller Scofidio, the sort of theoretical, is this architecture direction, or the direction of Philip Johnson, Venturi, Bob Stern, the sort of pastiche of historic forms. Suddenly we have a return to architecture as construction. And so what's surprising about this building as a sort of conclusion of the 1980s is its austerity and how this building is deliberately restrained. It's pure sort of canonical modernism, and it is the closest thing to a sort of manifesto of where architecture could go that we get from the 1980s. And the building is very simple. It's a steel shed in order to protect the lozenges and the steel from rusting and from melting. They needed to insulate the building and keep water off the building. And so they build these striated lines of wooden boards that lead to little wooden kicks that release rainwater off the building. And it's all supported almost like Japanese wood joinery, where you have the horizontal elements that are clearly supporting the wooden elements. And there is this beautiful logic to the building that then is enhanced by the rhythm and the proportion. And so it isn't an old limestone quarry. So you have the limestone wall on one side, and then you have the striated lines of the building on the other. And I think of Louis Kahn and his insistence that gravity be reflected in a building, where you notice the lines at the top are wider, and then where the rainwater would be coming closer to the building, and the building is now visually heavier, the lines become closer together. And at the top, the entire thing is given a cornice. Again, functional, it keeps the rain off, but it also gives the building, it takes it from being sort of, I think, pure shed into being architecture. It has a cornice, and what could be more architectural than that feature? Now, architecture students really ate Herzog and de Meuron up. They were architects. I think now they are just popular architects. But Andrew Blauvelt, the director of Cranbrook Art Museum, was at the time on a sabbatical replacement for Kathy McCoy. And he told me about sort of the eye-opening nature of this building, of the students and of himself, seeing this as being really quite similar to what Dan Hoffman and the students were doing, but also as an alternative to the sort of theoretical abstractions embodied by Diller Scofidio and the sort of postmodern pastiche that was the general sort of architecture in the air. I think of James Wine's and Sight, where on the left we have the sort of beautiful expression of structure, and on the right we have the illogical nature of structure, where the building can't possibly be doing that without lots of engineering, but it's unimportant as to what the engineering is, versus a building that is pure expression of construction. And Herzog and de Meuron, as I mentioned at the start, were students at the ETH architecture school in Zurich of Aldo Rossi. And they took Rossi's ideas of an analog architecture and associative architecture. But unlike Rossi, who would sheathe his buildings in plaster, making it impossible to know how it's constructed, Herzog and de Meuron reveal the construction of the building, much in the same way that Louis Kahn does. So here at the Indian Institute of Management, where you see these brick relieving arches that lead to the concrete support. And so the three-story building has three relieving arches. The bricks are telling you what they're doing. Here, the wooden panels are telling you what they're doing. And I think that they're getting back to a structural clarity that Mies van der Rohe was advocating for, particularly in his sort of seminal exhibition of structural rational logic, where the building features only the necessary parts, the steel and glass, and there is nothing else but structure, and that is architecture. And we compare that to an early house by Herzog and de Meuron, which is one of the 5 projects they spoke about here at Cranbrook. And we see at first, we think these are very different projects. One is made of wood, one is made of steel, one is sleek and smooth, the other is textured, almost getting Frank Lloyd Wright vibes. But look more closely at the plywood house. And how is it touching the earth? It has been raised up on an artificial ground. It is sitting on a platform. And this sort of first operation of the architect, it establishes the definitive sort of importance of this plane, this platform, and removing their architecture from being in the earth to sort of sitting upon it in that sort of classic high modern way. And then, of course, the plywood is forming the dimensions of the rest of the project. Now, it has this interesting kink in it that is a result of the tree that is sitting there. And so this large Paulownia tree, you get the sense that the house has had to move around it, but that hasn't really disrupted the structural logic of the building. And I think that is Herzog and de Meuron's great success in architecture. It's not funny, they're not being ironic. It's simply there's a tree and the house is going to bend around the tree. The house is made of wood, the tree is made of wood. We're expressing sort of different structural properties of the same material. And on the inside of the house, it is this real sort of celebration of what can one material and clear construction, how can it define architectural space? Their next project is just one of the most beautiful projects that I think we'll see in our history series, a little stone house in Italy, sitting high on the hill of an abandoned olive grove, where there is a structural frame of concrete that has then been filled in with the natural local method of building stone walls. And so you see it and you see the historic walls, and then the house just extends that language within this concrete frame. I think again of Louis Kahn's insistence on the concrete frame, but I also think of Albert Kahn, Detroit's great factory architect, and the way that a factory would be built with a concrete frame and glass or brick or wood between it. But Herzog and de Meuron elevate it into this sort of rarefied realm where the beautiful detailing of this concrete that has then been filled in by these beautiful stone walls gives, I think, some of Pallasmaa's, what he was fighting for, which is the sensation of all of your senses being sort of harmoniously held by the building. I mean, I would love to be in Italy on tonight, this blustery winter eve. But I think even through photographs, we are sort of taken to the warmth and the harmony between the site and the construction. And it comes out of this sort of Heideckian logic of the grid, except that the logic is a little bit self-defeating because this concrete grid is not actually the structure. It is ultimately a masonry building that is relying on those stones to support the concrete grid. And so in that sense, it's more akin to minimalist art as architecture. And Andrew Blauvelt, who was at the lecture, told me that this was a real eureka moment for him because it showed how minimalist art and architecture could sort of recombine into a new form. And if we compare it to Saint-Louis, I think that's a valid comparison, but I prefer a comparison that Raphael Moneo made, which in seeing the house, visiting it high on its promontory, he did not see a minimalist sculpture on a hill, but he saw the very Germanic idea of the wanderer above the sea of fog. The famous Caspar Friedrich painting of this sort of world being observed and framed by the sort of 19th century man, where just like in a 19th century novel, the narrator is literally present to recount this event. He is telling us what he is seeing. He is sort of looking out on the earth and saying, here is the kingdom. And I think the house is doing a little bit of the same thing. And the fact that the architecture can be read both ways, as pure abstraction, minimalist sculpture, or as this sort of kinship to 19th century painting, shows the way that Herzog and de Meuron are able to create communicative architecture that has meaning without resorting to kitsch or without resorting to sort of more narrative or technological devices. And the next project they presented at Cranbrook was the Frey Photo Studio, which is right on the Swiss border in Ville-en-Rhine, where you have this little house wrapped in timber, grained plywood, and concrete sheeting. But the most significant architectural move are these 3 skylights, which reflect the purpose of the building, a photo studio, as these sort of camera diaphragms or camera lenses for sunlight being brought into the structure. From here, Herzog and de Meuron go to Basel, where they build a little apartment block in a 13th century quarter of Basel. It's built on the inside of a block, much like Juhani Pallasmaa's courtyard, so it's invisible from the exterior. And then you come into the courtyard and you see this 2-story, almost Japanese-like wooden pavilion with a steel, glass, and concrete 3rd floor. And the details here are so haptic. I mean, I can just feel that sort of curve of the wooden column. You can smell the garden and sort of feel the breeze going down this row of windows. And I think it presents a very lyrical modernism in the vein of Alvar Aalto for a new generation, the 1980s. And if it was just the wooden frames, you might sort of accuse them of engaging in some sort of log cabin revival. But then on the top, they put this sort of deconstructivist hat, and I say that with utmost respect, where they sort of engage with that Libeskind almost aspect of floating steel beams and cables. That was very much the sort of fashion of the moment, but they really make it quite elegant, quite beautiful. It covers up the pathway, and then it covers up an outdoor courtyard here. And I think firmly places this building into its time, the 1980s. On a larger scale, an office building and apartment complex where on a curving site, they build 2 separate curves. So you'll notice the curve of the balcony and then the curve of the wall are different. So as the sun goes across the building, instead of just casting repeated shadows, the shadows move and transform and change the appearance of the building as you drive past it and as the sun crosses it each day. And then on the back side, they engage in this, again, sort of conversation with Alvar Aalto with this great floating concrete plane, very similar to his work at the Paimo Sanatorium. Now, these were the only projects that Herzog and de Meuron had completed when they lectured at Cranbrook. And so these were the ones that sort of electrified the architecture department in 1992. But I wanted to take a moment and trace their career a bit further, because they do become sort of starchitects with early important projects, also including the railway depot and signal box, where this humble building is wrapped in these copper wires that are twisted to allow views in and out of the rail yards. Or a housing plot, which begins its sketch almost as sort of 1980s minimalist art. And then it results in this construction of a sort of city plan in this ionic form of these great curving rows of houses, where what could have been a very standard, if not socialist, sort of row of lines of housing get all of their dynamism by these very subtle curves. What I love about Herzog and de Meuron's work is that they never abandon the sort of Swedish or Swiss vernacular from whence they come. And so starting with the House for an Art Collector and moving through the Rudin House and finally to the Vitra House, which is a furniture showroom, they are always interested in the sort of pitched roof as a landscape feature. What does it mean to drive through the European countryside and see the low pitched roof farmhouse with chimneys? And then how can they twist it to create these sort of new ideas in residential architecture? They continue to build for Ricola, including an addition to their little warehouse and a factory in France. Uh, they build the Domus Winery in Napa Valley, California, which is constructed out of gabions, which are large blocks of loose rubble rocks wrapped in steel cages. And they're used in Switzerland to build concrete or to build pylons for highways. But here they wrap the entire building in these sort of blocks held in by steel mesh. The breakout building, as far as the public was concerned, was their 1994 competition-winning entry to rebuild the power plant on the banks of the Thames River in London into the Tate Modern, with its wonderful Kunsthal, the great turbine hall where contemporary artists stage interventions. This led to a number of important civic projects, including the De Young Museum in San Francisco. And then they build the Bird's Nest in Beijing for the 2008 Olympics and will be used again in 2022 for the Winter Olympics. In Miami, they build a parking structure that is also an art gallery, hair salon, and apartment. And in Hamburg, they build a Philharmonie, which is sort of your Frank Gehry idea of historic preservation, restoring a historic warehouse and then building an office tower in this completely new form on top. And in New York, they build what's sometimes referred to as the Jenga skyscraper. And back in London, they build the twisting addition to the Tate Modern in brick. Now, Diller Scofidio also have had an illustrious career, and all of these architects are living and all are still now leading quite large practices. And I want to now trace Diller Scofidio's practice because they really run quite a distance from where they were in the 1980s to where they are now as far as being global architectural superstars. The breakout Diller Scofidio project was the Blur building, which was part of the Swiss Expo in 2002. It used 34,000 nozzles to spray out purified lake water, cost some 12 million francs for a summertime cloud. It was beloved by the Swiss public and by the critics, and it sort of served no purpose other than to exist in this strange architectural space of the cloud. And at the top of it was the Angel's Bar, where only water was served on tap. The Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston became their first substantial civic structure and has this wonderful theater that looks down into the South Boston Harbor. They're still engaged in a redesign and reconstruction of Lincoln Center, adding in that sort of theatric moment of having the playbill scroll across in LEDs on the steps of Lincoln Center, and then building a restaurant next to Eero Saarinen's Vivian Beaumont Theater. They perhaps are most famous for designing the High Line, the great elevated horizontal park stretching through the west side of Manhattan on disused rail lines, where they attempted to create this sort of prairie wilderness back into New York City. They're designing a new North Campus for Columbia University. The second building is about to be dedicated. And here you see, I think, some of that avant-garde experimentation finally realized at a full and permanent scale. For Eli and Edith Broad, they build a building next to Frank Gehry's concert hall in Los Angeles, where you enter in through this sort of fleshy lower interior and you sort of shoot up the escalator through an earlobe and you come out in top in this great sort of skylit space, all of the building wrapped in this perforated concrete skin. Back in New York, the project that perhaps has made them be considered sellouts by some critics, working on America's most famous development, the Hudson Yards, the city in a city. But I think the idea that Diller Scofidio Renfro, with the addition of Charles Renfro in 2004 to the firm, that they are somehow sort of sellouts or overly commercial, I think that ignores the realities of being an architect. And I say that because when I was a student, Diller Scofidio Renfro were not exactly who you wanted to be as an architect, because their projects seem to be so disconnected from their early work. I think that They have not, in fact, abandoned their avant-garde roots. They have been given, though, new opportunities. And as Liz Diller says, how am I supposed to turn down the chance to build a skyscraper? And so I think it perhaps gives the architect too much autonomy to say that they shouldn't, are somehow that these projects are overly commercial, when in fact she's given a multi-million-dollar budget to build what is essentially a moving, rolling, experimental theater on wheels. Now, Juhani Pallasmaa has continued to also produce work: a shopping center and transport hall in Helsinki, a museum in the Northern Wilds, and his own villa of silence in the woods. I said I would return to the arrival feature. And so just to wrap up tonight, I think that the arrival feature, it does embody Pallasmaa's own idea of the body in space in this phenomenological reading where you can touch the different materials, you can smell the nature, feel the breeze, but it also is engaging with the sort of shifts in scale that we see with Diller Scofidio, where it exists on this sort of time aspect where there is a little analemma up here that is acting as a sundial. So it exists within the scale of the calendar of the sun. It also is related to the scale of the moons and the planets. It's designed so that on the last day of Earth in 900 million years, this piece is going to be doing something. It's telling us about geography, about what is north and south, but then it's cutting that geography and twisting it. It is an enigmatic, intentionally enigmatic piece that relates to a number of ideas of immigration and construction, of detailing. And it also is a piece of architecture that is designed to be seen through a windshield, much like the slow house. So it is an architecture for the pedestrian and for the car. And in these ways, the sort of ways to misread are to read, to be scientific are artistic. I think Pallasmaa, in his only US work, creates this sort of moment in time, 1994, 1995, quite perfectly in the middle of Cranbrook's campus. Now, I hope you enjoyed this look at three different and interesting architects, from the poetic work of Juhani Pallasmaa, who is more renowned for his writings on architecture, and I encourage you to check them out when I send the reading list in 2 weeks, to the sort of inside outsiders of Diller Scofidio, who worked within multiple media in multiple forms to suggest and critique the contemporary world and culture, to Herzog and de Meuron, who saw architecture as a visual unfolding of construction, and where construction becomes the very substance of the architecture. Next week, our last week, we'll look at visitors to Cranbrook in the 2010s, Jeannie Yang, Greg Pasquarelli, and David Adage. Can't wait to conclude the series and bring it right up to today with you all next week. If you have questions, feel free to unmute or to type them into the chat feature.
Was Diller and Scofidio more sculpture than architecture?
That is a great question. And when we think about questions of, is it architecture? We can either say to ourselves, yes, it is architecture, or no, it is not. It's a little bit like art in that sense. But for me, because Elizabeth Diller says she is an architect, and because she always sort of frames her pieces in architectural language, how she talks about them, but also how she draws them, even if her drawings are art pieces, and those drawings of Slow House are in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, even if her practice is so beautiful and artistic, they are ultimately architectural drawings. So she is designing blueprints for buildings, even if they don't look like the blueprints we might know. And I don't think that we can really undersell the fact that in the 80s, no one was commissioning buildings from them. So had they been given a chance to build more houses like the Plywood House, maybe we wouldn't have seen so many theater sets and sort of sculptural representations. It's a hard life to be an architect, particularly in the late 20th century and into today. And so I think that what she did, and with her husband and partner, is she created a way to express architectural ideas in the opportunities that she could get.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
We are quiet today. The only question that I have is regarding your background today. If you want to talk a little bit about your little caveats.
Well, we have a traffic cone for Diller Scofidio, obviously, which is a in-use Cranbrook traffic cone. Got public safety on the case to find me one. And then over here we have some Ricola for the Ricola warehouse. And then Mr. Pallasmaa, just his book is there. It was a busy weekend. I couldn't reconstruct the arrival feature out of cardboard and popsicle sticks. Other questions?
I had a question, Kevin.
Yes.
I was going to write it, but I might as well just ask. But so it seems like in Scarfilio's early work, there was almost this critique on the television culture that I was getting that seemed to be in the work, and that culture was kind of at its height in the 80s and 90s. Was she commenting on that?
You know, it's interesting. If I was an architect and had to write a monograph, I would absolutely employ Mr. Edward Dimmenberg, who is a film critic, and he wrote the book on Diller Scofidio in 2009. He spent about a decade researching their practice. And one thing that he talks about in the early years, that first decade, 79 to 89, is just how underanalyzed Diller Scofidio were and how far outside of architecture and art they were. And so it's interesting because in retrospect, they are now world famous star architects. And so we can go back and say, yes, they're involved in these greater conversations. But as he sort of traces, they're actually, some of their projects are reviewed as architecture, none are reviewed as sculptures, even when they were presenting them as sculptures, like in San Francisco, that was an art gallery that staged the architecture exhibit. So I do think that it is possible, as I did tonight, to read it historically into this sort of critique of visual culture of film and television, but I'm not sure at the time where exactly they would have fit on the sort of scale of the rest of sort of critics and theoreticians who are thinking on the same things. I was looking for a picture. I do not know why I can't find it, but Charles Moore, in his PhD thesis at Princeton, he did all of his building drawings through a car windshield with the windshield wipers going across the drawings. And so, Diller Scofidio are really engaging in this history of sort of the billboard as architecture, but also of screens as architecture. And I think if I gave this talk again in a year, I think I might draw out that idea of everything that Diller Scofidio are doing is very much mediated by the screen, whether it is the screen of the car, the screen of the seat of the theater, or the screen of the building. Or in the television screen, of course.
I have a couple for you in the chat. I think you were about to answer the one about your pin.
This is a little pin my mom and I picked up in South Korea at a South Korean market, but I thought it looked a little Diller Scofidio, roving circles, shapes.
Right. Was the recent monolith art in Utah desert the work of Diller?
That is a great question. I love your speculation. I look forward to your blog post. The film of the Pepsi building, so they were actually filming, it's the PepsiCo Tower, which it's interesting that Diller Scofidio did not know that that was an example of a work by a woman architect. So Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill had a woman partner, Natalie Dubois, and that building of hers was being, at the time, that was Disney inside of it. So it was actually Disney executives who were wondering who is in a hotel with a camera. And what's interesting is they wanted a building that was both sort of canonical, gridded glass and steel modernism, which is the sort of Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill approach to design. And they needed a building that was at a 4:3 television aspect ratio because they wanted to show the film on television screens. And so those windows happen to be the aspect ratio and have a hotel across the street. You can actually see it if you go to the Diller Scofidio Renfro website, which is one of the most impressive architectural archive out there. It's where my images tonight came from. And her videos are posted online, so you can watch the whole film. And they advertise things like window glass that even in daylight reflects yourself. So day or night, you see yourself and the world sees you. Going into that narcissism of the 80s office executive. Other questions?
Kevin, Diller Scofidio's work is reminiscent of Christo's work. Do you know if they interacted?
I'm sure they did, because Christo is another one of these artists who knows how to market himself in a way that I think Elizabeth Diller certainly is on the scene. So I'm sure that they've interacted. I'm not sure what their relationship as far as their work goes. You know, it's interesting. I saw Elizabeth Diller when she spoke at the College of Creative Studies in 2017, maybe, down at the GM building. And I remember her talking about being an outsider. I didn't really know her work well. I knew her for the High Line, for the Hudson Yards Tower. And she presented herself as this ultimate outsider, that, you know, she is just this radical avant-garde. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, anyone who is demolishing a Todd Williams and Billy Chin building to rebuild the Museum of Modern Art is hardly an outsider. These projects are on this global scale for billion-dollar projects. But in preparing for this lecture, I can see exactly why she said that, because she really was an outsider for so long of both the art and the architecture world.
Are Dillers and Scofidio making a commentary about architecture and voyeurism in their work, the use of mirrors,
Yes.
video equipment, screens, etc.?
Absolutely. And I think the obsession with the self, the narcissism of living in a glass house, the narcissism of living in sort of shiny architecture.
Okay, this one is a little bit longer. David wants to say that this was by far the most divergently separate of the three architectural theoretics. The previous were closer in outlooks, one theoretical, one artistic, and one fetishized materialism detail. How do you envisage the connection of tonight's talk theme?
Great question. Clearly, I did not achieve what I often hope to achieve, which is that we can make those connections together in the talk. I'm not you know, Juhani Pallasmaa is a generation older, but I included him tonight, even though he actually spoke here in the 70s as well, because of his influence on architecture in the 80s and 90s, and particularly architecture schools. I mean, I had to read Juhani Pallasmaa as an undergrad still. So his influence in creating the sort of beauty in architecture. And I think that Pallasmaa he never writes directly about Diller Scofidio, but he writes about contemporary architecture and contemporary criticism. And he writes about how disconnected from reality, disconnected from architecture, and disconnected from the sort of joy of living it is. So he is a little bit sort of critical of people like Diller Scofidio. And I think Herzog and de Meuron, they present an alternative. They present a return to a pure modernism. If Diller Scofidio can't sort of lose the sort of, I don't know, weight of John Haydock at the Cooper Union, Herzog and de Meuron, with this Swiss tradition of modernism, really come in and say, you know, actually, you don't have to have theoretical angst. Your building doesn't have to be a critical commentary, and your building doesn't have to be poetic. It can just be a building. So I think they show three different ways that architecture moves. And I think they also show the disconnect between the academy and built practice that is becoming more and more apparent as we go on, until we get to today, 2021, where debatably architects have abdicated enormous swaths of ground. When you think about the way that Aalto, Wright, and Le Corbusier thought about architecture, or Eliel Saarinen thought about architecture, from the teacup to the city, and then you think of what the architect thinks is within their realm today, that transition had to happen somewhere. And I think it happened through these sort of interfield combats of different ways of being an architect and of thinking about an architecture. I don't know if that answered the question. Clearly, I'm still working all this out in my mind. It is such a unusual way to lay out a lecture series, to say, well, these three people spoke in relative proximity to each other at one school, therefore I shall give a lecture on the three of them. And I think it is creating these moments where all three of these people were working concurrently. All three were admired enough by Dan Hoffman or his students to get them to Cranbrook. And what does that say about where American architecture was around 1990? Any other question? Well, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. As always, if you have additional questions, you can email me at kadkison@cranbrook.edu or at center@cranbrook.edu. I know some of you were on Adam Nathaniel Furman's talk on last Thursday. I hope you enjoyed it. Yet another way to be an architect, an artist, and eccentric. We'll be back next week for the series finale, week 5 of History of American Architecture, Cranbrook Visitors. Be safe, stay warm, and I can't wait to see you 1 week from tonight.